I'd been warned about that trail more than once, usually with a shrug and a half smile, the way locals talk when they don't want to sound superstitious. It cut off from the main forest road just past a rusted cattle gate and vanished into a tangle of rhododendron and second-growth pine. People said it used to lead somewhere, a homestead, a hunting camp, maybe an old logging spur, but no one could agree on what or when it stopped being used. "It don't go nowhere good," was the most consistent thing I heard. I took that as Appalachian understatement, the kind born from boredom more than danger, and one late afternoon I decided to walk it anyway. I told myself it was curiosity, but really I wanted the quiet. The main trails had grown busier in recent years, hikers with trekking poles and Bluetooth speakers bleeding noise into the woods. This path promised the opposite. It was narrow and nearly swallowed by brush, the ground soft with years of unbroken leaf fall. Every step released the smell of damp earth and rot, that deep, loamy scent that sticks to your clothes. I noticed almost immediately how still it was. No bird song, no squirrels barking, just the faint hiss of wind moving high above me. I'd gone maybe 20 minutes in when I saw him. He stepped onto the path ahead of me as if he'd been standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. Thin was the first thing I noticed. Not just skinny, but worn down, like a person reduced to essentials. His clothes hung off him in loose, uneven layers, pants too big, cinched with twine, a shirt that might have been flannel once, but was now faded into a grayish blur. His hair was long and matted, pressed flat to his head in places, sticking out in others. He was hunched slightly forward, shoulders rounded, neck craned like he wasn't used to standing upright for long. I slowed, then stopped a few yards back. He turned his head toward me, movements careful and deliberate, as if each one required thought. His eyes caught the light filtering through the canopy and reflected it back too sharply. They were bright, almost glassy, set deep in a face that looked older than it should have been, creased and weathered in odd patterns. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice neutral, friendly. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here." He stared at me. His jaw worked, muscles flexing like he was chewing something invisible. His lips parted, then closed again. No sound came out. The silence stretched long enough that I felt it pressing against my ears. I considered turning around right then. Something about him made my skin prickle, but there was nothing overtly threatening. He hadn't moved closer, he hadn't raised his hands, he just stood there, watching, breathing so shallowly I couldn't hear it. After a moment, he stepped aside, making room on the path. I nodded, a reflex, and walked forward. As I passed him, I caught a smell that made my stomach tighten. Wet leaves, old smoke, and something sour beneath it all, like unwashed skin that had been rained on too many times. I expected him to stay where he was. Instead, I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more of shifting of weight. And when I glanced back, he was walking alongside me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. But there was no sound, no crunch of leaves, no brush of fabric. It was like he glided just above the ground. We walked that way for nearly a mile. I tried to talk, partly to fill the silence, partly to anchor myself in something normal. I asked if he was from around there, if he needed help, if he was lost. Each question hung in the air unanswered. He never looked away from me, his gaze fixed on my face, my hands, my pack, like he was cataloging me piece by piece. I stopped abruptly, turning to face him fully. He stopped too, instantly, so close I had to lean back to avoid bumping into him. Up close, the smell was stronger. His skin was smeared with dirt, ground into the creases around his mouth and eyes. His pupils were large, swallowing most of the color, and there was a faint tremor in his jaw, like he was fighting an urge. "Can you hear me?" I asked. He lifted one hand slowly, palm facing inward, crooked fingers. He reached out and touched the sleeve of my jacket, just the fabric, brushing it lightly, then tracing the seam with a fingertip. The touch was tentative, almost reverent, like a child encountering something new. His skin was rough and cold. "Don't," I said, backing away. "Stay back." That's when he smiled. It wasn't wide or exaggerated. It didn't bare his teeth. It was small and slow, one corner of his mouth lifting just enough to change his whole face. There was no warmth in it, no recognition. It felt practiced, like he'd seen the expression somewhere and remembered it meant to mean something. He stepped backward, still smiling, and then he was gone. One moment he was there, the next he slipped sideways into the brush, swallowed by it without a sound. No crashing branches, no rustle, just absence. I stood there longer than I should have, heart pounding, listening. The woods remained unnaturally quiet. Eventually, I convinced myself he was just a local hermit, someone who chose isolation over society and forgotten how to behave around people. Appalachia was full of stories like that. I turned back the way I came, suddenly eager to reach my camp. I'd set up a small site near a creek earlier that day, tucked into a stand of hemlocks. By the time I got back, the light was fading, shadows pooling thick and blue between the trees. I built a fire and cooked quickly, nerves making me clumsy. The normal sounds of evening never quite returned. No frogs, no owls, just the fire crackling and the water sliding over stones. As night settled in, I kept replaying the encounter in my head, the way he hadn't spoken, the way he walked without sound. I told myself I was letting my imagination run ahead of me. Still, I made sure my pack was close, my boots within reach. Sometime after dark, I heard footsteps. They came from just beyond the firelight, slow and careful, matching the pace I'd used earlier that day. Step, pause, step. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped when I stopped moving. When I shifted my weight, they shifted too. "Hello?" I called out, forcing steadiness into my voice. The footsteps retreated a few steps, then began again, circling the edge of the light. I caught glimpses of movement, shadows slipping between trees, never fully entering the glow. Once I thought I heard breathing, but it might have been the wind through the branches. I stayed awake most of the night, fire burning lower than I liked, but exhaustion dragged me under eventually. I dreamt of hands tracing the seams of my clothes, over and over. At first light, I woke with a start. The fire had burned down to ash, the last embers cold. The forest felt wrong, too open. I stood and stretched, then noticed the ground around the fire pit. The ashes had been disturbed, small handprints pressed into the soot, fingers splayed, some overlapping. Too small to be an adult's, too deliberate to be an animal's. They ringed the pit, coming close, then pulling back, like whoever made them had been testing how far they could go. I didn't pack carefully. I shoved everything into my bag, doused the pit with creek water, and started hiking out as fast as I could manage without running. Every sound made me flinch. Branches snapping behind me sent my heart into my throat, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I didn't see him again, at least not clearly, but more than once I felt eyes on me, a presence pacing just out of sight, matching my stride. When I finally reached the main trail and the distant sound of a car, the tension drained from me so suddenly, my knees went weak. I never went back to that path. I didn't tell the locals what I saw either. Some stories don't need to be shared to stay alive. Even now, years later, I think about the way his jaw worked, like speech was something he'd misplaced and couldn't quite find again. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods and the sounds fall away too suddenly, I catch myself slowing down, listening, not for footsteps behind me, but for the moment they stop when I stop. I took the cabin because it was cheap and because it was far enough out that no one else wanted it. That should have been the warning, but at the time it felt like a blessing. The road up to it was barely passable, rutted and soft from recent rain, and by the time I parked, my phone had been without service for nearly an hour. The silence that settled in after I shut off the engine felt heavy, like something pressing down on my ears. The cabin sat alone in a shallow hollow, backed by dense woods that climbed steeply on 3 sides. It was meant for hunters. 1 room, a small wood stove, bunks built into the wall, and windows just big enough to let in light, but not much else. I told myself I needed the isolation. I'd been running on empty for months, city noise and people wearing me thin. The woods had always felt like a reset. My grandfather used to say the mountains could hold your worries if you let them. Standing there with my pack slung over my shoulder, listening to the wind move through the trees, I believed that again. The first night was uneventful. I cooked, built a fire in the stove, and settled in early. The woods outside made their usual sounds: insects, the occasional owl, branches shifting. It all blended into something almost soothing. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're far from everything familiar. The screams started just after midnight the second night. At first I thought I was dreaming. The sound slid into my awareness slowly, threading itself through sleep. When I woke fully, my heart jumped hard enough to make me gasp. It wasn't close. It came from far off, echoing faintly through the trees. But there was no mistaking it. It was human. Not a clean scream, not a single cry for help. It was broken, uneven, rising and falling like someone testing how loud they could be. Like they were practicing pain instead of feeling it. I sat up in my bunk, every muscle tense, listening. The scream came again, slightly closer this time, then again from another direction. It moved through the woods, circling the cabin, never approaching directly. Each time it sounded just a little different, like the person making it was adjusting, refining. I told myself it could be someone hurt, a lost hiker, but the pattern didn't fit. There was no urgency, no desperation, just repetition. I stayed awake until dawn, the screams fading as the night thinned out. When the light finally crept through the windows, the forest looked ordinary again. Sunlight caught on wet leaves. Birds started up like nothing had happened. The silence of the night felt like it had been folded away. I tried to rationalize it while I made coffee. People did strange things in the woods. Maybe it was someone messing around, trying to scare off hunters. Maybe it was a prank. The explanations felt thin, but daylight has a way of making fear feel exaggerated. Still, I couldn't let it go. After breakfast, I grabbed my boots and followed the direction the screams had come from last. The ground was soft, the understory thick with ferns and low brush. It didn't take long to find signs of disturbance: flattened leaves, scuffed dirt. As I pushed deeper, the woods grew quieter again, the air thick and still. The noise had ended abruptly the night before, cutting off mid-scream like someone had flipped a switch. I found where it stopped. The clearing was small, roughly circular, ringed by young trees bent inward. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Then I noticed the traps. They were old, iron jaws rusted dark brown, half buried in the dirt. Some were snapped shut on nothing, others were set, springs coiled tight. They weren't arranged randomly. They formed a loose pattern, spaced just far enough apart that you'd have to step carefully to avoid them. Bits of cloth were tied to branches above, strips of flannel, denim, faded and frayed. They fluttered slightly in the breeze, catching the light. Footprints crisscrossed the mud. Bare feet, adult-sized. They overlapped and doubled back, circling the traps, weaving through them with practiced ease. I had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that I was standing in the middle of something meant for someone else. I didn't stay long. The longer I stood there, the more aware I became of the woods around me, of the way the trees seemed to lean in. I felt watched, not in a vague, spooky way, but with a certainty that made the back of my neck burn. I left the clearing quickly, resisting the urge to run. Back at the cabin, I debated packing up and leaving. Pride and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that I couldn't abandon the trip because of one unsettling night. I locked the door that evening, more for my own peace of mind than anything else, and kept the lantern low. The screams returned after midnight. This time they were closer, not right outside, but close enough that I could hear breath behind them, the wet sound of a throat working. They moved again, sliding through the woods, circling, always just out of sight. And mixed in with them now was laughter. It wasn't loud. It came in short bursts, breathy and uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. It rose between screams, punctuating them, as if the two sounds belonged together. I pushed the table against the door and dragged a bunk over to brace it. The windows were small, but I covered them anyway, blankets tacked up to block out the dark. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, shotgun across my knees, listening. The sounds went on for hours. Sometimes they overlapped, scream bleeding into laughter until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Other times, everything would go silent for long stretches, the kind of silence that presses in on you until your ears ring. In those moments, I was sure I could hear footsteps, slow, careful, testing the ground. At one point, I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin. Not a knock, more like something being dragged lightly along the logs, then stopping. I held my breath, waiting for the door to rattle, the windows to shatter. Nothing happened. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off sitting upright, because I woke with my neck stiff and my mouth dry, the world washed in gray light. The woods were quiet again. No screams, no laughter. I moved the furniture back slowly, listening for any sign of movement. When I opened the door, the cold air hit me like a slap. The ground outside was churned up, footprints everywhere, overlapping and circling the cabin, pressed deep into the mud. Some came right up to the door, others wandered off toward the tree line and back again. Something else caught my eye. Just beyond the steps, scratched in the dirt with a stick, was a crude drawing. A square with a triangle on top, windows marked with X's. Inside, a small stick figure lay flat. Another stick figure stood outside, arms raised. The simplicity of it made my stomach turn. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and my gun and left the cabin door swinging open behind me. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone standing in the road, watching me go. The road stayed empty. I reported the traps to the ranger station later that day, once I had service again. They took notes, nodded, said they'd look into it. They didn't ask many questions. I didn't tell them about the drawing. I don't go back into the woods the same way anymore. At night, when I hear distant sounds, sirens, laughter drifting from somewhere I can't see, I think about how those screams never came closer, how they didn't need to, and I wonder how many people have stood in that clearing, listening, believing they were alone, while someone practiced the sound of pain just beyond the trees. There were 4 of us on that trip, all grown men who thought we knew the woods well enough to relax around them. We'd camped together plenty of times before, scattered across different parts of Appalachia, and nothing worse than a startled bear or a sudden storm had ever come of it. This place was deeper than most, though. The trailhead sat off a Forest Service road that barely showed up on the map, and the hike-in took us through long stretches where the canopy closed tight overhead and the air felt old and unmoving. No cell service, no distant traffic, no sign of anyone else having passed through recently. That was part of the appeal. We wanted quiet, and we got it. We reached the clearing just before dusk, a small bowl of ground ringed by tall hardwoods and thick underbrush. Someone had camped there years ago. You could tell by the blackened stones and the faint depression where a fire pit had been, but nature had mostly taken it back. We dropped our packs, gathered wood, and had a fire going before the light drained completely from the sky. Spirits were high. We joked, cooked, passed around a flask. The forest around us stayed calm, night sounds settling in the way they always do. Crickets, distant owls, leaves whispering as the temperature dropped. It wasn't until the fire started to die down that we noticed anything was wrong. At first, it was just a sense of being watched, the kind that creeps up on you without a clear reason. The flames had burned low, throwing more shadow than light, and the edges of the clearing blurred into darkness. I remember looking up mid-conversation and seeing movement just beyond the fire's reach. Not a shape exactly, more like a distortion, as if the darkness itself had shifted. I said something about it, half laughing, and one of the others turned to look. That's when we saw them. They were crouched low, right at the edge of the light, bodies folded in on themselves in a way that didn't look comfortable. Human silhouettes, unmistakable once you focused, but wrong somehow. Too still, too patient. One leaned forward slightly and its eyes caught the glow of the embers, reflecting back a dull orange shine. No one spoke for a few seconds. We all just stared, waiting for them to move, to run, to do something that made sense. My heart was hammering, but my brain kept trying to fill in normal explanations. Other campers, locals messing with us, a trick of the light layered over nerves and exhaustion. Then we heard the whispering. It came from more than one direction, soft and clipped, like pieces of words broken off before they could fully form. Not quite language, but not animal either. The sounds passed between the shapes, back and forth, quick and purposeful. Coordination, communication. Someone cursed under their breath and reached for another log, tossing it onto the fire. The flames flared, light spilling outward, and the shapes were coiled immediately. They didn't scatter, they didn't panic, they simply withdrew a few steps, melting back into the darkness just far enough to stay out of the glow. No one suggested going to sleep after that. We fed the fire constantly, taking turns watching the perimeter. Every time the flames burned low, we'd see movement again, those same crouched forms easing closer, stopping right at the invisible line where the light ended. If we let it go too long, they crept closer than before, not into the clearing, never fully into view, but close enough that we could hear them breathing, shallow, controlled. The whispering continued through the night. Sometimes it sounded like counting, sometimes like imitation, the cadence echoing bits of our own speech from earlier, stripped of meaning. We stopped talking altogether after a while. It felt safer not to give them anything new to learn. At some point, exhaustion took over. The fire burned low, then lower, and before we could react, the darkness pressed in. One of the shapes leaned forward far enough that we could see more detail. Stringy hair hanging in clumps, skin smeared dark with dirt. Its mouth opened slightly, and a sound slipped out that wasn't quite a word, but carried the shape of one. The fire flared again, and it withdrew. Morning came slow and gray. When the light finally filled the clearing, the forest looked ordinary again, painfully so. No shapes, no whispering, just trees and damp leaves and the cold remains of our fire. For a moment it felt like we all shared the same bad dream. Then we checked our food. Everything was gone, not torn open, not scattered. Gone. Coolers dragged away without a trace, bags emptied clean. Even things with no scent, utensils, wrappers, had vanished. We stood there in stunned silence, the reality sinking in piece by piece. It wasn't until one of the guys went to lace up his boots that we noticed those were gone too. Not the boots themselves, just the laces. Cleanly removed, pulled free, and taken. Every pair. The implications of that hit hard. It wasn't random theft, it was deliberate. Someone had taken exactly what would slow us down, exactly what would make leaving harder. We didn't debate what to do next. We packed what little we had left and started hiking out immediately, barefoot. The ground was cold and unforgiving, sharp stones biting into our feet with every step. We moved fast anyway, adrenaline carrying us through the pain. We didn't make it far before we heard them. Soft footsteps behind us, matching our pace. When we slowed, they slowed. When we stopped, they stopped. Always just far enough that we couldn't see them clearly. Occasionally, we'd catch a glimpse of movement between the trees, a shoulder slipping behind a trunk, a head ducking low. No whispering this time, just the sound of feet on leaves, careful and unhurried. We stayed close together, trying not to panic. Every mile felt longer than the last. My feet were numb by the time we reached the steeper part of the trail, pain blurring into something distant and unreal. The forest felt tighter here, trees crowding in, underbrush snagging at our clothes. The footsteps behind us never faltered. At one point, I stumbled, catching myself on a rock, and when I looked back, I saw one of them clearly for the first time in daylight. It stood upright now, taller than I expected, arms hanging long at its sides. Its face was slack, eyes fixed at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. It didn't advance, it didn't retreat, it just watched, head tilted slightly as if studying how I moved. I grabbed one of the others and pulled me forward, and when I looked back again, it was gone. The trail eventually widened, the trees thinning out that light filtered through in stronger bands. The footsteps faded, not all at once, but gradually, as if whoever was following us had decided we'd gone far enough. We didn't stop until we reached the car. We didn't look back. None of us talked much on the drive home. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound ridiculous out loud. We cleaned our wounds, laughed it off for the sake of our families, and agreed never to go back there again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the way they never crossed into the light, how patient they were, how methodical. They didn't rush us. They didn't need to. They knew the woods better than we ever could. And every so often, when I'm camping and the fire burns low, I find myself staring into the darkness beyond its glow, listening carefully, afraid of the moment when I realize I'm not the only one watching. I'd been walking that ridgeline since early afternoon, following a faint trail that only showed itself in patches where the leaves hadn't fully reclaimed it. The map marked it as an old access route, nothing official, just a dotted line that faded the farther east it went. I liked those kinds of trails. They felt honest, like the land hadn't been repackaged yet. The climb was slow and steady, the air thinning and cooling as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains. By the time I reached the top, my legs were burning and my pack felt heavier than it had any right to. That was when I saw the cabin. It sat just off the ridge, tucked into a stand of evergreens, positioned so it caught the last of the daylight without being fully exposed. Smoke curled from a short stovepipe, thin and steady. I hadn't seen any other signs of life all day. No fresh tracks, no cut branches, so the sight of it made me stop short. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening. Everything felt still, but not empty. The old man stepped out onto the porch before I had a chance to decide whether to approach. He moved carefully, like every motion had been practiced to avoid wasting energy. He was lean, wiry, his back straight despite his age. His beard was gray and neatly trimmed, his clothes clean and mended. That was the first thing that struck me, how put together he was. Out here, that kind of order took effort. "You look tired," he said, voice dry but steady. I nodded, suddenly aware of how I must have looked, sweaty, dirt-streaked, road-worn. We talked for a few minutes, nothing important, where I was headed, how far I'd come. When I mentioned I was camping for the night, his expression shifted, just slightly. "You got light?" he asked. I told him I did. Lantern, headlamp, extra batteries. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll trade you," he said. "Beans for batteries." He held up a can, label faded but intact. It felt like a strange offer, but not unreasonable. Out here, batteries were worth more than money. I handed him a fresh pack. He turned them over in his hand, satisfied, and passed me the can. "Don't stay after dark," he said, as he stepped back toward the door. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't smile. "Why not?" "They come for the light," he said simply. Then he went inside and closed the door. I stood there for a moment, unsettled despite myself. The ridge was quiet, the sky already deepening into purple. I considered asking him more, but pride and curiosity won out. I thanked him, wished him a good night, and moved on. I set my camp a little ways down the ridge, close enough that I could see the outline of his cabin through the trees, far enough that I felt like I had my own space. The ground was level, sheltered from the wind. I cooked early, ate the beans straight from the can, and waited for night to settle in. When it did, it came fast. The stars blinked on one by one, sharp and bright. I lit my lantern and set it beside me, the warm glow pushing back the dark just enough to feel comfortable. I thought about the old man's warning, replayed the way he'd said it, flat and certain. I told myself he was just eccentric, another mountain recluse with his own rules. That's when I noticed the stars disappearing. Not all at once. One here, then another, blotted out as if something tall had moved in front of them. I looked up, squinting, trying to make sense of it. Clouds weren't in the forecast, and the sky had been clear moments before. The dark shapes shifted slowly, blocking more light as they gathered around the edge of my clearing. They didn't step into the lantern's glow. They stopped just beyond it, forming a loose ring. Human silhouettes, too many to count easily, standing or crouching low. I couldn't see faces, just the suggestion of heads and shoulders, the occasional glint of an eye catching the light. My heart started to pound. I stood slowly, keeping the lantern between me and them. "Hey," I called out, forcing my voice to carry. "I don't want any trouble." No answer. They swayed slightly, weight shifting from foot to foot, like they were adjusting to my presence. One leaned forward, arm extending just far enough that its fingers brushed the edge of the light. It recoiled immediately, hissing softly, then retreated. Another moved closer from behind me. I felt breath at the back of my neck, warm and damp. Something sniffed my hair, deep and deliberate, like it was memorizing my scent. I froze, every muscle locked in place. Panic hit all at once. I grabbed the lantern and ran toward the old man's cabin, lights swinging wildly, shadows leaping across the trees. The figure surged after me, staying just outside the glow, matching my pace with ease. When I reached the spot where the cabin should have been, there was nothing there. No porch, no walls, just empty ridge and trees, the ground undisturbed, as if no one had ever built there at all. I stumbled to a stop, breath tearing out of me. The figure slowed, encircling me again. The lantern flickered, its light dimming. Hands reached towards it, grasping, pulling. I fought to keep hold of it, but there were too many. The lantern was wrenched free, its light snuffed out in an instant. The darkness closed in, thick and absolute. I don't remember running, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft footfalls around me. I must have tripped, must have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the trees. I was alone. My pack lay beside me, untouched. My lantern was gone. I sat up slowly, head throbbing, afraid to look around too quickly. The ridge was empty, silent in that early morning way that feels almost reverent. Where my lantern was the night before sat a can of beans, unopened. Beside it, neatly placed, were my batteries, empty casings, drained completely. I didn't wait. I packed up and left, legs shaking, eyes darting to every shadow. I didn't see the old man again. I never found the cabin, but sometimes when I think about that night, I wonder if he was ever there at all, or if he was just another cut of the ridge, a warning shaped like a man, trading what little safety he had for a bit more time in the dark. I took the job because no one else wanted it. That's usually how these things start. The property sat at the end of a washed-out road deep in the hills, a rental cabin owned by a distant cousin who lived 2 states away and only visited once every few years. He needed someone to stay there for a week in late fall, keep an eye on things while a contractor was supposed to come check the foundation. The contractor never showed, but by the time I found that out, I was already unpacked. I told myself a quiet week alone might do me some good. The cabin was older than it looked in the photos. The porch sagged just enough to make you watch your step, and the logs had darkened with age, their seams packed with old chinking that flaked if you pressed it. Inside, it smelled like dust and cold wood. There was electricity, but it felt unreliable, the lights flickering if you turned on more than one thing at a time. No cell service. That didn't bother me much. I'd grown up in these mountains. Silence felt familiar. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I slept heavy, the kind of sleep that comes when the nearest neighbor is miles away. I heard the usual sounds, wind in the trees, branches knocking together, something moving through the leaves, but nothing that made my pulse spike. On the 3rd night, though, the woods went quiet earlier than usual. No insects, no owls, just the low hum of the cabin settling as the temperature dropped. I was sitting at the small table near the window, reading by the overhead light, when the knock came. It was soft, just one knock, not on the door itself, but somewhere near it, like knuckles brushing wood more than striking it. I froze, book halfway closed, listening. I waited for a voice, for a follow-up knock, for anything that would make it make sense. Nothing came. After a long minute, I told myself it was a branch. The wind had picked up and the porch was cluttered with leaves and debris. I went back to reading, though my eyes kept drifting toward the door. The second knock came exactly the same as the first. Same volume, same spacing, same place. My chest tightened. Someone knocking that softly, that deliberately, wasn't looking to be let in for help. It felt like a test. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I sat there, counting my breaths, waiting to see what would come next. Nothing did. 5 minutes passed. 10. The light flickered overhead, then steadied. I stood slowly and crossed the room, peering through the small window beside the door. The porch was empty. The darkness beyond pressed close, thick with trees. I couldn't see past the edge of the light. I almost laughed. Almost. When I sat back down, my phone buzzed weakly, trying and failing to find a signal. I told myself I was letting the quiet get to me. That was when I heard it again. Knock. Same rhythm, same pressure, like whoever was out there was careful not to make a mistake. "Yeah?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I liked. "Can I help you?" The knocking stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the air itself was waiting. I stood, heart thudding, and moved back to the window. That's when I saw the face. It was pressed right up against the glass, so close I could see the fog of its breath. The eyes were wide, whites showing all around, fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. The mouth hung open slightly, lips cracked and pale. Dirt smeared the skin in uneven streaks, packed into wrinkles that suggested the person didn't wash often or ever. I stumbled back, barely catching myself on the table. When I looked again, I saw there were others behind it, shapes stacked in the darkness, crowding the porch, craning to see inside. As I shifted my weight, the face in the window shifted too, mirroring me. When I raised my hand, slowly, it raised its hand in the same way, fingers curling awkwardly, like it was copying something it had seen but never quite learned. I backed away until I hit the far wall. My mind raced through explanations, locals messing with me, drunks, some kind of prank. None of them fit. No one came this far out for fun, and no one stood that still, that quietly, unless they meant to. I reached for the light switch and flipped it off. The cabin fell into darkness, lit only by moonlight bleeding through the windows. I held my breath, listening for movement, for footsteps retreating, for voices. They didn't leave. I could see their outlines still pressed close to the glass, heads tilting, bodies shifting just enough to tell me they were still there. One of them lifted a hand and dragged it slowly down the window, leaving a faint streak in the condensation. Another leaned close to the door, head cocked, listening. I spent the rest of the night crouched on the floor of the bedroom, the door locked, my back against the wall. Every so often, I'd hear the soft sound of fingers brushing wood, moving along the logs, pausing, then moving again. Not knocking, feeling, measuring. At some point, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow sleep. I dreamed of standing on the porch, knocking once, waiting, copying myself through the glass. When I woke, the sky was just beginning to gray. The sounds were gone. The woods had started to breathe again, birds calling tentatively like they were checking to see if it was safe. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, pulled on my boots, and unlocked the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth and old leaves. The porch was empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. As I stepped outside, I noticed the door frame. Fresh scratches marred the wood at hand height, deep enough that splinters curled outward. Not claw marks, finger marks. Too many in some places, overlapping, like more than one person had reached for the same spot. I didn't go back inside. I left the cabin unlocked, keys on the table, and walked down the road until my legs burned. When I finally reached a place with service, I called my cousin and told him I couldn't stay. I didn't explain why. I don't think he would have believed me anyway. I still think about that night more than I want to, about the way they knocked only once, about how carefully they waited. Sometimes when I'm home alone and the house settles just right, I find myself listening for that soft, deliberate sound on the door, and I wonder how many times they've stood outside other places, learning the shapes of people through glass, waiting for someone to answer. I grew up around old rail lines. In the part of Appalachia where I'm from, the tracks run like veins through the mountains, some still active, most long abandoned. People treat them like shortcuts or places to walk when the roads disappear into brush. As a kid, I learned early which ones to stay off. There are lines folks don't talk about much, except in half sentences or with a look that says you should know better than to ask. The line that cuts through Miller's Holler was one of those. It hadn't seen a train in decades, not since a rock slide took out part of the route, and the company decided it wasn't worth fixing. The tracks were still there, rusted and half swallowed by weeds, and a narrow bridge crossed a deep creek where the walls of the holler pinched tight. I'd heard stories about people hearing things out there, but I'd also heard stories about lights in the sky and headless dogs, and I didn't put much stock in any of it. I was walking that line because I needed to clear my head. I'd been back home a few weeks, staying in my grandmother's old place after she passed, sorting through things and trying to decide what came next. The mountains have a way of reminding you who you used to be, and I thought a long walk might help me remember something useful. It was late afternoon when I stepped onto the tracks. The air was cool, the kind of early fall chill that smells like wet leaves and iron. Gravel crunched under my boots, loud in the quiet. The trees leaned in close, their branches knitting together overhead in places, turning the path into a tunnel of shadow and filtered light. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I barely registered it. The sound blended with my own steps, the same rhythm, the same crunch of stone. I assumed someone else was using the line, maybe another local out for a walk. I didn't turn around right away. Around here, it's not unusual to pass people without much acknowledgement. But the longer I listened, the more it bothered me. The footsteps didn't drift closer or fall behind. They stayed exactly where they were, a few yards back, matching me step for step. When I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, they did too. I stopped. The footsteps stopped at the same moment, gravel settling into silence. I turned around, heart thudding, scanning the tracks and the tree line. The rails stretched back the way I'd come, empty. No one stood on the ties, no movement in the brush. Just the hollow quiet of the holler, the creek murmuring somewhere far below. I told myself I'd imagined it. Sound plays tricks in these valleys, bouncing off rock and wood, turning your own noise into something that feels separate. I turned back and started walking again. The footsteps returned immediately. This time I was sure they weren't mine. There was a slight delay, just enough to register as a second presence, not close enough to see, but close enough to feel. The hairs on my arms lifted, a cold prickle creeping up my spine. I tried talking. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. No answer came, but the footsteps didn't stop. I didn't turn around again. I focused on the bridge ahead, a dark line cutting across the tracks where the holler dropped away. If I could just reach that bridge, I'd be closer to the road on the other side, closer to open ground. As I walked, I caught glimpses of movements out of my corner of eye, shapes slipping between the railroad ties, low to the ground, keeping pace. When I tried to look directly at them, they vanished, leaving only the impression of something that didn't want to be seen clearly. The bridge loomed up fast. It was an old wooden trestle, planks weathered gray and warped with age, gaps wide enough to see the water rushing below. I hesitated at the edge, the drop making my stomach tighten. The footsteps behind me drew closer, closer than they'd been before, the gravel crunching louder now, impatient. I turned around. They were there, finally visible, though not in any way that made sense. Not faces or bodies, not something I could count, just a cluster of shakes pressed into the shadows between the trees and the tracks, hunched and still. I felt their attention like a weight, heavy and focused. They didn't step onto the bridge. They spread out instead, fanning across the tracks behind me, blocking the way I'd come. One shape leaned forward slightly, and I heard a sound like a breath being drawn through clenched teeth. Panic flared, sharp and hot. I didn't think. I bolted across the bridge, boots slamming against the planks, hands out for balance as the structure shuddered under my weight. The creek roared below, louder than it had any right to be, filling my ears. I expected to hear them following me, the boards creaking, the bridge groaning with more weight. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just my own ragged breathing and the rush of water. I reached the other side and didn't stop until I was well clear of the bridge, the tracks stretching ahead into thinner woods. When I finally slowed, my legs shaking, I risked a glance back. The bridge was empty. The tracks on the far side were empty too. It was as if nothing had ever been there at all. I laughed then, a short, shaky sound that felt wrong in the quiet. Adrenaline makes you do strange things. I told myself I'd spooked myself over nothing, that my mind had filled in gaps with fear and old stories. I turned back towards home, sticking to the tracks but keeping my eyes forward, my pace brisk. I didn't hear the footsteps again. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was dipping low, painting the tops of the trees gold. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, hands clenched on the steering wheel, waiting for my heart to slow. When it finally did, I drove home, the image of those shapes already starting to blur at the edges of my memory. It wasn't until later that night when I noticed the bundle. I was unpacking my bag, shaking out leaves and gravel, when something tugged against the strap. I frowned and lifted it, bringing it closer to the light. Tied to the fabric was a small bundle, no bigger than my fist, bound tight with strips of vine. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen it there before. I was sure of that. I would have felt the weight, noticed the pull against my shoulder. With shaking fingers, I worked the knot loose. Inside were twigs snapped to uniform lengths, bits of dried grass, and hair, human hair, coarse and dark, wound around the sticks in tight spirals. The smell hit me then, a faint but unmistakable scent of earth and sweat and something old. I threw the bundle into the sink and scrubbed my hands until the skin burned. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the house made me sit bolt upright, listening for gravel crunching, for footsteps that matched my own. In the morning, I drove back towards the holler, telling myself I needed to see it again in daylight to prove to myself it was just a place like any other. I didn't make it far. As soon as the old tracks came into view, that same tight feeling wrapped around my chest, squeezing until it was hard to breathe. I turned around. I haven't walked that line since. I don't tell people about it really. If it comes up, I just say I don't like abandoned tracks, that they're dangerous, that bridges can give way without warning. Those things are true enough. But sometimes when I'm hiking somewhere else and my steps echo just a little too closely behind me, I stop without meaning to. I listen, and for a split second, I'm back in Miller's Holler, feeling watched by things that know how to follow without being seen, waiting for you to cross a line you can't come back from.
I hadn't planned on staying more than a long weekend. My uncle's trailer sat on a narrow cut of land he'd bought decades ago, back when folks still hunted and trapped those hills instead of selling them off. It was the kind of place you reached only after pavement gave up, then gravel, then a rutted dirt road that felt more like a suggestion than a guarantee. Trees pressed in on both sides, tall and close, their branches arching overhead like they were trying to seal the place off from the rest of the world. By the time I pulled in, my phone had lost signal miles back, and the only sound was my engine ticking as it cooled, and the steady chorus of insects warming up for night. The trailer itself was old but sturdy, aluminum siding dulled by years of rain and sun. My uncle used to say he liked it because it didn't creak like a cabin. Quiet walls, he called it. That felt comforting at the time. I unloaded my gear, locked the truck out of habit, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust, old coffee, and something earthy that never quite aired out. I told myself it was just damp ground and neglect. I opened a few windows, set my cooler by the small table, and tried to enjoy the isolation. That first night, I fell asleep easier than I expected. No neighbors, no traffic, just the low hum of the woods. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was wind brushing against the trailer, but it had weight to it, rhythm, slow steps, one, then another, deliberate,
measured, crunching softly in the leaves and dirt. They moved along the length of the trailer, paused, then continued, circling. I lay still, heart thudding, counting my breaths. Bears were common enough, and my uncle had warned me about keeping food sealed. I told myself that was all it was, a bear sniffing around, curious, maybe catching the scent of my cooler. Still, I didn't move. The steps went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, tracing a lazy loop around me. Eventually, they faded back into the woods, swallowed by the night. Morning brought sunlight and the confidence that fear always looks foolish by daylight. I stepped outside with my coffee, scanning the ground for reassurance. I expected wide, heavy paw prints. What I found made my stomach tighten. The mud around the trailer was soft from recent rain, and the prints were clear. Bare feet, long and narrow, toes splayed oddly, pressed deep like whoever made them put their full weight down with each step. There were more toes than there should have been impressions for, overlapping as if the person walked with their feet turned or dragged slightly. No claw marks, no fur, just human-like footprints circling the trailer. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee cooling in my hand. People didn't come out this far by accident, and they sure as hell didn't walk barefoot through mud and gravel. I tried to laugh it off, told myself maybe some local kid thought it'd be funny to mess with the outsider. But there was no road traffic, no other tire marks, just my own. The rest of that day passed in uneasy quiet. I kept busy, cleaned the trailer, checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed intact. When evening came, I cooked inside, sealed the cooler, and double-checked that nothing with a scent was left out. I told myself I overreacted. Fear thrives on silence, and there was plenty of that. That night, I heard it again. The pacing started later this time, slower somehow, closer. Each step felt intentional, like whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was lying inside. The steps stopped right outside my bedroom wall. I could almost feel the presence through the thin aluminum, a shape blocking out the night air. Then, after a long pause, it moved on, continuing its circle. I lay still, heart thudding, counting my breaths. Bears were common enough, and my uncle had warned me about keeping food sealed. I told myself that was all it was, a bear sniffing around, curious, maybe catching the scent of my cooler. Still, I didn't move. The steps went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, tracing a lazy loop around me. Eventually, they faded back into the woods, swallowed by the night. Morning brought sunlight and the confidence that fear always looks foolish by daylight. I stepped outside with my coffee, scanning the ground for reassurance. I expected wide, heavy paw prints. What I found made my stomach tighten. The mud around the trailer was soft from recent rain, and the prints were clear. Bare feet, long and narrow, toes splayed oddly, pressed deep like whoever made them put their full weight down with each step. There were more toes than there should have been impressions for, overlapping as if the person walked with their feet turned or dragged slightly. No claw marks, no fur, just human-like footprints circling the trailer. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee cooling in my hand. People didn't come out this far by accident, and they sure as hell didn't walk barefoot through mud and gravel. I tried to laugh it off, told myself maybe some local kid thought it'd be funny to mess with the outsider. But there was no road traffic, no other tire marks, just my own. The rest of that day passed in uneasy quiet. I kept busy, cleaned the trailer, checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed intact. When evening came, I cooked inside, sealed the cooler, and double-checked that nothing with a scent was left out. I told myself I overreacted. Fear thrives on silence, and there was plenty of that. That night, I heard it again. The pacing started later this time, slower somehow, closer. Each step felt intentional, like whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was lying inside. The steps stopped right outside my bedroom wall. I could almost feel the presence through the thin aluminum, a shape blocking out the night air. Then, after a long pause, it moved on, continuing its circle. I lay still, heart thudding, counting my breaths. Bears were common enough, and my uncle had warned me about keeping food sealed. I told myself that was all it was, a bear sniffing around, curious, maybe catching the scent of my cooler. Still, I didn't move. The steps went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, tracing a lazy loop around me. Eventually, they faded back into the woods, swallowed by the night. Morning brought sunlight and the confidence that fear always looks foolish by daylight. I stepped outside with my coffee, scanning the ground for reassurance. I expected wide, heavy paw prints. What I found made my stomach tighten. The mud around the trailer was soft from recent rain, and the prints were clear. Bare feet, long and narrow, toes splayed oddly, pressed deep like whoever made them put their full weight down with each step. There were more toes than there should have been impressions for, overlapping as if the person walked with their feet turned or dragged slightly. No claw marks, no fur, just human-like footprints circling the trailer. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee cooling in my hand. People didn't come out this far by accident, and they sure as hell didn't walk barefoot through mud and gravel. I tried to laugh it off, told myself maybe some local kid thought it'd be funny to mess with the outsider. But there was no road traffic, no other tire marks, just my own. The rest of that day passed in uneasy quiet. I kept busy, cleaned the trailer, checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed intact. When evening came, I cooked inside, sealed the cooler, and double-checked that nothing with a scent was left out. I told myself I overreacted. Fear thrives on silence, and there was plenty of that. That night, I heard it again. The pacing started later this time, slower somehow, closer. Each step felt intentional, like whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was lying inside. The steps stopped right outside my bedroom wall. I could almost feel the presence through the thin aluminum, a shape blocking out the night air. Then, after a long pause, it moved on, continuing its circle. I lay still, heart thudding, counting my breaths. Bears were common enough, and my uncle had warned me about keeping food sealed. I told myself that was all it was, a bear sniffing around, curious, maybe catching the scent of my cooler. Still, I didn't move. The steps went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, tracing a lazy loop around me. Eventually, they faded back into the woods, swallowed by the night. Morning brought